Welcome to the 30/30 Health Podcast. The following discussion is for education and entertainment. It is not intended to diagnose or treat disease. Please do not apply any of this information without first discussing it with your doctor. Here is your host, Dr. Ruiz.
Hello everyone, super excited about today's show. Today marks the 1-year anniversary of the 30/30 Health Podcast. And to celebrate, I invited one of my most popular guests on the show, Dr. Chris Masterjohn. In today's episode, we discuss his new ebook, Testing for Nutritional Deficiencies. In his book, he gives you the guidelines to test, identify, and correct possible nutritional deficiencies that might be affecting your health. He was also generous enough to offer my listeners a discount. So if you haven't picked up his book, wait until the end of the show and get the promotion code so you can get a $5 discount on his ebook. And as a quick reminder, tickets for PaleoFX 2018 are on sale. And if you've never been to PaleoFX, the largest paleo conference in the world, this is your chance. This conference helped launch my career and it has shaped my philosophy of practice. So if you haven't, go grab your tickets before they sell out. And I hope to see you in Austin this April. Once again, thanks for listening. I appreciate any comment or any questions that you might have. And remember to visit my website, 3030strong.com. I hope you enjoyed the show. Hello, everyone. I'm super excited to have one of my BFFs in the health industry, Dr. Chris Masterjohn. Chris, how you doing?
I'm doing great, Guillermo. How you doing?
Fantastic. And I've been dying to talk to you about your latest ebook because you sent me a copy of the ebook. Immediately I got it, I opened it, and I was like, oh, this guy's full of shit. And the next day, I was using your ebook to help my patients get better. You know, like whenever you go to a training, people say, oh, you're going to be able to use this in 24 hours the next day at your practice. And yeah, sometimes that's the case, maybe you'll remember, but I've been using your ebook almost daily to kind of like figure out what are some of the nutritional deficiencies that my patients have. And that's amazing. The way you put it together, there's basically 3 perspectives. There's the how to test for something that you might have a hunch that someone has deficiency in. Second, symptoms. If you have these symptoms, this is what you should test. And third, if you're deficient on something, this is what you do. Full of actionable things that you can give your patients.
Guillermo, you're talking about this like you just came out of a $3,000 training that I did, but I gave you my $30 ebook for free.
I know, dude, and that's why it's so exciting. And I immediately talked to Ari Whitten, which you just did an interview with him, and to my mentor, Dr. Alan Christensen, about talking to you because the way you put this together is like brilliant. Now, a year ago, we talked about the 101 of fats, the different, omega-3s, omega-6s, and, all that. So I want to talk about the 101 on nutritional deficiencies. But before we start there, I want to know how or why you came up with this book.
Yeah, so it kind of started from what I was doing last year in 2017, where I was like trying to come up with podcast material. And I'm like, hey, I got a PhD in nutritional sciences. I've been immersed in the last decade in all this stuff. And I get questions all the time about, should I run this test? Should I run that test? How do I figure out these things? And so what I started doing was I started spending 2 weeks of doing nothing else to put together a podcast episode that would take like an hour and a half or 2 hours and go into each nutrient in depth. And it would tear apart like, this is what it does in the body. This is why you need it. This is what happens when you don't have enough. Here's how to know if you don't have enough, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And so very, very scientific, but also all leading to the practical what to do. And my audience loved this, but there were some problems with the model. So first of all, there were some people who just wanted that information, but 2 hours was too long for them to listen, or the technical detail went over their heads, or they loved it, but they're trying to convince their grandmother that they need more folate, and they know their grandmother's not going to listen to a 2-hour episode about folate. right? And so then there's the people who just 100% loved it. They only know geeks, and so they'll share it with whoever, but they're waiting for the next episode. And here I am, like struggling. Like it takes me 2 weeks to put one of these together. It's going to be like 2 years before I produce the full series. And so I got an email from a colleague, Christopher Kelly from Nourish Balance Thrive, who said to me, "Look, um, I love your material, but I'm always hunting down, trying to find the information, and I'm like searching through your transcripts, and it's really time consuming. I'd totally pay you if you just put a PDF together that's a cheat sheet with all your recommendations in one page." And so I'm like, you know what? That's a good idea. So then I start asking for some help on my team to actually put together this cheat sheet. So I asked people, can you go through the podcast that I've done and select this and that? And then I got people helping me who are saying, Chris, I can't find, I'm looking through your Selenium post, like I can't find where this is and that is. And then I'm looking through it and I'm like, geez, I can't find it either. And so that really convinced me all the more that the simplicity and the putting everything all in one place is really useful. And I've gone through this in multiple cycles with my content, where when I first quit my faculty job and started on my website at the end of the year before last year, I was in a position where I was trying to find content on my website to answer people's questions on email. And I'm like, I want to tell the people, just go to this link and this link. And then I'm looking for it. I'm like, where's the link? I can't find my own stuff. So in putting this together, I wanted to make a cheat sheet. And initially the logic was put it all on one page. But then as I'm putting it together, I'm like, it's really meaningless to tell people, if you want to test your iron status, you should get this, this, and this test, and they should be between this and this, if they don't understand the other legs of evidence that you need to look in someone's history. Because it's not true that there's a cookie cutter approach where just because some value on a lab came back at X, you need to do Y. Like, we need algorithms, but the algorithm can't be that oversimplistic. You must understand where the person is coming from, what they're eating, how they're living, in order to understand the probability that something's actually out of balance. And you need to understand whether there's any manifestation of that, right? So if someone has night blindness and they don't eat liver, they don't take cod liver oil, they don't take vitamin A supplements, and maybe they have the genetics that don't allow for conversions of carotenoids, or they just don't eat a lot of red, yellow, orange, and green vegetables, and they have hyperkeratosis in their skin, and their serum retinol comes back deficient, well, then you got a case of vitamin A deficiency. But there may be many cases where their serum retinol comes back kind of on the low end of the range, but it looks normal. And in one person, that might be consistent with perfect health if they don't have the flaky skin, they don't have the night blindness, their diet looks normal, right? But on the other hand, there might be someone else where that low normal, when you look at the rest of the picture, makes it like you just got to make a decision. Like, look, that's like they're in the range, but obviously for them, this isn't doing well enough. And if you change that person's diet or you give them the right supplement and then all their problems go away, then you have yourself a really solid case. So you need to know more. And so what I did with this was I tried to make it as cheat sheet as possible and yet give you all the tools you need. And that wound up being, this has to be 78 pages long, but I have to design it in a way that someone can just read one page and then decide exactly what they need to read and what they don't, so that they can use it as efficiently as possible.
One of the most beautiful things about this is the testing part of the ebook, how to test for these common deficiencies. Because there's like labs that put in, we're going to do a micronutrient analysis. And they have their own special way of testing, whether it's RBC, whether it's leukocyte, But you went through the literature and you said this is the way that the literature supports the testing of each one of these micronutrients. To me, that has been so useful. We can have a blanket approach to testing, which you give suggestions on what labs to use, and then a more microscopic analysis of each one of the nutrients. So when you designed this book, were you thinking about practitioners or were you thinking about patients? And then second, how can they use it in their own respective ways?
So I'm really thinking about both, and I'm thinking about this from both a practical perspective and a philosophical perspective. So on on a philosophical level, I just believe in empowerment, right? So if I were gonna try to do something that was practitioner centric exclusively, then I'd be doing something much more higher priced. I'd be leveraging my connections to try to make high priced trainings, et cetera, et cetera. But then I'm kind of, I mean, that's very needed, but I don't want to create a situation where I'm just raking in cash where I'm not helping the people who don't have that much cash.
Or the license.
Well, yeah, but I mean from like a patient perspective, right? Like some people don't have the choice to go to the best functional medicine practitioner because it's not in their price range in the situation that they're in, right? So everyone should have the ability and everyone should be empowered to be able to take the approach that's right for them to figure out what they need for their nutrition. And so in giving this to practitioners and to individuals, then that's empowering to everyone because you're using it to help your patients. But other people can use this because maybe they don't have any choice except to go to whatever doctor is local to them, doesn't really understand nutrition, doesn't really understand functional medicine, and they can say, look, I've collected this information that makes me think that I need these tests, and they can support it. And if they can make a convincing case, like a lot of times the doctor will work with them, or someone might be going through directlabs.com, et cetera, and be able to manage their case in that way. But from a practical perspective, I think that we need both practitioners and patients to understand what's going on, right? Like you when you work with your patients, obviously you're the expert, right? But don't you feel better about it when your patients understand what you're doing?
Over and over, I tell my patients that they know much more about their condition than me because I'm not experiencing it.
Right. And so I imagine, I've never been your patient, but I imagine that in whatever time you have available, you try to educate your patients and help them understand. Well, so do I with my consulting clients. But I'll tell you what, all the people who are my health and wellness package consulting clients, I gave this away to them for free because I'm thinking from the perspective of we have an hour together in a call. If you can get as educated as I can get you without doing any work on my part, except what I put into that ebook, if I can bring you up to that level, imagine how much more powerful our 1 hour discussion is going to be, right? So if there's a way to bring your patients to a higher level before they come into you, then you can just achieve far more with them because you're both educated and you're now working with a higher quality sort of raw material to try to bring that person to instead of you just telling them what they could have learned already, you're giving them in that little time that you have with them only what you can give them.
And that was my philosophy of practice ever since I started school. Let's put together a blog. Let's put together this podcast so I can carve the niche so I don't get people that are completely uneducated about an ancestral diet, about sleep. So by the time they get to me, all of that has been ticked, that it's done. They understand where, the foundations, and they still haven't got to the best health they can. So now I don't have to spend my 1 hour of doctor time that they're paying a premium for explaining to them that lactose in lactose intolerant people is not good. So it's so
Yeah.
basic, And then on the doctor side, you never stop learning. And being able to know that if you have excess vitamin C, you can cause problems. If you have excess iron, you can have different problems. Because people would sometimes might come to my as a patient and say, hey, I am thinking about doing a vitamin C challenge and I want to take 30 grams of vitamin C orally. And you're like, okay. And now I have a quick way of referencing why that might be a bad idea.
Iron is a particularly crazy one because you can have a person who, depending on their life stage, is vulnerable to iron deficiency anemia at one point in their life, and then iron overload in another part of their life, and some of the symptoms are the same. Like, they're not exactly the same, but if you look at the cluster of symptoms, like the fatigue and a bunch of them line up pretty well. So you can have someone, for example, who has the genetics for hemochromatosis, but they're a premenopausal woman. They have a pretty heavy menstrual flow for most of their life. They spend 30 years being vulnerable to iron deficiency anemia that causes a specific set of problems that they associate with that. And then a decade into menopause, all of a sudden they have the opposite predisposition that has many of the same symptoms. And if they don't understand that, and they don't understand the testing, or they don't have a doctor who's really well versed in that, then they may think that, oh, whenever I'm iron deficient, I got to eat X, I got to supplement with Y. And then all of a sudden those things start making it worse. And if you don't understand it, you can imagine that person thinking, it's getting worse, I need to double down on this. And only, after years, or in that case, they might actually figure out that they've been making it worse and they need to do the opposite now.
Let's dig a little bit more into iron deficiency anemia. So for my listeners, anemia, if I want to concentrate it and give the most basic explanation to what anemia is the inability of oxygen reaching your tissues. Plain and simple, like you can have a bleed, you don't have enough blood to carry oxygen, you're going to have anemia. You might have a nutritional deficiency in folate B12, you're not carrying enough oxygen to your tissues, you have anemia. Or you can have iron deficiency anemia, which iron is necessary for the red blood cells to carry oxygen. Okay, but there's nuance, because each three things have different ways of being treated. For example, in the case of folate and B12, maybe supplemented with folate and B12 will help you. In the case of bleeding out, of course, fixing the wound, whether it's you lost a limb or you have hemorrhoids or an ulcer, fixing that will help you. And of course, iron, we discussed a little bit. And then there's anemia of chronic disease. And that's a completely different beast. Okay.
Oh, yeah.
And you have made it in a very concise way. And I kind of geeked out on iron a couple of months ago, and I learned a lot about iron anemias, I should say. And so I have a kind of a protocol. But if you don't have a month to study what anemias and how anemias present,
right,
pulling this PDF and reading these 3 paragraphs, it's pretty much good enough to treat 90% of the patients that come to you with anemia. So let's talk about folate. And this is where I see what you just mentioned, I have a folate deficiency, so I'm going to supplement with more folate, and then you end up with the same symptoms, so you keep getting more. And the nuance comes in that there's some people that are over-methylators, or you're not receiving the right type of folate. So can you talk a little bit about that, the difference between an over-methylator and an under-methylator, and why it's important to know which type of folate to supplement with and which type of B12? And even if you want to go into a little bit of the testing.
Let's back up a little bit and start with this question of anemia, right? So we kind of pitched this as anemia could be one or the other. So you can imagine someone has fatigue, shortness of breath on exercise, any number of symptoms of anemia. And then when you look at a complete blood count, they're going to look quite a bit different. So usually if iron deficiency is the problem with anemia, you're going to have lower hemoglobin levels. Your red blood cells will probably, not necessarily, but probably be smaller. So the MCV, which is a measure of how big the red blood cells are, is going to be smaller. But if you have folate or B12 deficiency anemia, it's quite different, because in that case, the problem is that you need a specific form of folate in order to synthesize DNA, and you need to double your DNA every time you duplicate a cell. And in folate deficiency or B12 deficiency, you lose that type of folate that you need, and you can't synthesize DNA as rapidly. And what happens is when you're trying to produce red blood cells, they keep growing and growing, but they can't divide because their DNA doesn't duplicate fast enough. So you wind up with really large red blood cells that don't function normally. and you wind up seeing high MCV. Now, you could have a case where someone's deficient in both, and that kind of messes with all the testing that you might observe. And it's not not necessarily that uncommon, because oftentimes when people, for iron deficiency, you can have someone who eats a good diet but just loses a lot of blood. But quite often you have someone who eats a poor diet, and so they're deficient in multiple nutrients. But the thing is, there are other things that folate and B12 are doing that have nothing to do with that anemia. And that's where you really get into the uniqueness of this, because in that case, you are likely, if someone's folate deficient, you're probably going to have that person being predisposed to undermethylation, because folate is needed for methylation. And if you don't have enough folate, you can't support that process. And the same thing is true with B12. Folate and B12 actually work together in supporting methylation. And so if you have B12 deficiency anemia, you are unlikely to be able to support that methylation process. So methylation is actually involved in dozens of different things, but about 45% of your methylation is to synthesize creatine, and another 45% of your methylation is to synthesize phosphatidylcholine. So if you're undermethylating, then besides the weakness that comes with the anemia, you may have weakness that's due to lower creatine levels in your muscles. And that's probably going to especially manifest in response to exercise, but it depends how bad the problem is. You use creatine all the time, even when you're sleeping and even when you're resting. And so if it actually drops significantly, that may cause an additional layer of fatigue where you're really feeling it in your muscles. But fatty liver is a serious problem that can come from undermethylation, because if your phosphatidylcholine levels decline, you can't put phosphatidylcholine in your cell membranes. And it's not just your cell membranes, it's also the membranes of the lipoproteins that carry fats in your blood. And you need to make those lipoproteins in your liver in order to get fats out of your liver and into your blood, where they can be distributed to other places in the body. So if you have a lot of fat coming into your liver from the diet or being synthesized in your liver from other things, and you don't have enough phosphatidylcholine in your liver because of undermethylation, you're very likely to wind up with fatty liver disease. There's other things that could come from undermethylation. So in pregnant women, neural tube defects are a problem with that, and that's mostly, but it's probably the case that just undermethylation in general, so other things that impact methylation when they're deficient, are going to cause neural tube defects. But there's also a lot of things that can come with your neurotransmitters. So if you're undermethylating dopamine in your brain, then you're going to become more mentally rigid, and that can have a positive side to it, because if you are more mentally stable, like basically things need to be higher value to grab your attention. In that case, it may work out well for you if you are trying to focus on things. But the downside to that is, what if what you're focusing on is a thought that produces anxiety, or it's a thought or a thought pattern or a feeling that produces depression? Then suddenly you're much more vulnerable to those mental health issues, because if you have a healthy level of dopamine methylation, that thought comes into your mind and you're like, I don't like that thought, I'm going to think about something else. But if you have too much rigidity in your mind, as soon as that enters, then it grabs a hold of you in a way that you need to work really hard to try to free yourself of it, instead of just moving your attention to the next thing.
Guy Nate, in his book, described dopamine not as the reward neurotransmitter, but as the teaching neurotransmitter. And that's exactly to your point. It's not about, like the reward of cocaine. It's about teaching those brain pathways to do the same motion, on the rats, to give cocaine, and until they die, they just keep pressing that button.
Yeah, it drives me nuts when people do, like, there's this sort of, it comes out in scientific research, but I think of it as a meme, where someone does some study that shows something does something to dopamine, and then they're like, this thing acts just like cocaine. But the reality is that every single thing that is a new and novel stimulus creates a dopamine spike. And our brains read the value of placing attention and motivation on that thing according to the dopamine spike. And some things create bigger dopamine spikes than others. And one of the things that makes a difference is the novelty. So we can get bored of something because it's less novel each time we're exposed to it. So it creates less and less of a dopamine spike. But that plays into our normal mindset because our brain looks at the size of that dopamine spike and asks the question, is this a big enough dopamine spike for me to attach my attention and motivation from moving it from wherever it is now onto that thing? And that means that every time we're keeping our attention there, dopamine is playing a role in that. And our brain looks at that dopamine spike and measures it against the background dopamine tone. So there's this pool of, it's like sea level with waves rising above it. Sea level is the dopamine tone. And then these pulses that come that tell us how valuable something is for our attention are like the waves. And we look at how big that is. And so what methylation is doing is altering that level of dopamine tone. And if we have undermethylation, the dopamine tone is really high, and the pulses of dopamine that come in with new stimuli look really small. And so our brain reads that and says, I'm not sure there's much value there. That can be great. Like I was saying before, if what you're trying to do is focus on writing a scientific paper and what's popular now? I don't know. Some cartoon character shows up on the screen next to you because your roommate is watching TV, and your brain's like, I don't really care about whoever that is.
Rick
right?
and Morty.
And yeah, okay, great. Clearly, I haven't been watching enough TV. So, if you're able to ignore those things, that's great. But like I was saying before, the real problem is if you're focusing on the way this person hurt you last year, and it's the only thing that you can think about, and your roommate's like, hey, let's go do something fun because I love you and I really value you, and your brain's like, not sure that's worth it. I think that I should be focusing on how that person hurt me last year. Like, you're going to be pretty sad, you know? And so undermethylation is going to make you more vulnerable to those things. Overmethylation, by contrast, is going to give you the opposite problem where you're distracted by everything. The leaf blows on the tree and you're like, wow, that was interesting, because it's more interesting than whatever you're doing. And so you really want an optimal balance, and the methylation nutrients are super important there. We can go into more detail on that if you want, or we can move on.
Well, no. So let's talk about testing, okay? So you have within the cheat sheet, you have different levels of testing. You have like the ultimate testing, and then you have individual, and then you have like the most affordable testing. Can you talk about what the all-encompassing testing does?
Sure. So the way that I'm thinking about this is, if your insurance covers it or you can afford it, the ideal way that you get information is you take all of the most rigorous tests of nutritional status and you just do all of them. And that's, for someone who's paying out of pocket, that's probably going to cost a couple $1,000s. But, everyone's situation is different. And so the thing is, when you're starting out with some objective measure of what is actually going on biochemically in your body, you will reach the correct conclusion about what to do a lot faster. And so it becomes an issue of what are the resources at your fingertips. Now, if you don't have the financial resources to do comprehensive testing like that, you need a way to get the right conclusions as fast as you can given your situation. And the way that I recommend doing that is, let's do the things that don't cost money. So one of the things that doesn't cost money is to go into the index of the cheat sheet and look at the index of 178 signs and symptoms of nutritional deficiencies, toxicities, or imbalances, and just check off the ones that you have. One thing that doesn't cost money is to measure what you eat. So track your food for a week and use something like Chronometer or some equivalent that can give you feedback about where your nutrients are relative to the percent of the recommended values, and see where you're falling behind or where you're getting a lot. And I also recommend people measure their blood pressure, because if you have high or low blood pressure, that is an important indicator of electrolyte balance. So, but that kind of falls into looking through the signs and symptoms. Like that would be a sign or symptom of electrolyte imbalance in most cases. So if you have this information, then you can say, okay, well, I'm falling below on this, and this vitamin. Maybe to take the example before, I got plenty of B12. I'm falling behind in folate. I got plenty of iron. And so probably folate makes sense. Then you're looking through and you're like, yeah, I'm vulnerable to depression and anxiety. And it does seem like it takes me a lot of effort to get those thoughts out of my head. Now you have two big indicators pointing in a certain direction. Do you test for that? Well, it depends what your strategy is. So if everything is pointing towards one single thing, you can just look and say, you know what? I'm just not eating a lot of green leafy vegetables. I don't eat liver. I don't take a supplement that has folate in it. Then you can do a really low cost strategy of modifying your diet or taking a supplement. And so all these sections in here, right? If the cheat sheet tells you go to the folate section, there's an action protocol for if your folate levels are low. Try these foods, try these supplements. And so you just do the action protocol in the context of what is low risk, right? So you're not going out and taking 3 grams of folate. You're just taking the moderate dose that's consistent with a low risk strategy. And if you do that and all of a sudden you start feeling great, you don't need to test anything if testing is difficult for you or if testing is not affordable for you. On the other hand, let's say you come back and you look, well, my iron's normal, my B12 is normal, my folate's normal in my diet, but I feel anemic.
According to the rubric that you've created on how.
Yeah, you're looking through the signs and symptoms and you're like, this says iron deficiency, folate deficiency, B12 deficiency. You come up with 7 things that all say iron deficiency, B12 deficiency, folate deficiency, anemia. And you're like, this is really consistent with anemia, but it also says that this, and this is consistent with iron overload. My iron's normal in my diet, right? Then you need to run the testing, because what the algorithm, so to speak, is telling you is this is most likely either iron deficiency or iron overload, and you must discriminate between those two possibilities, because either action protocol, no matter how low risk it seems, basically if one is right, then the opposite action protocol is going to do you harm and vice versa. And so here you don't do comprehensive testing. You just say, I have a hunch that it's A or B. Let's go differentiate now. And you only do the testing that is actually needed, and you come back with an answer, and then you do the action protocol.
And that's the biggest advantage over something like genomic testing, because you might have the genetic predisposition. You might have the blueprint of what, house you're going to build, but that doesn't mean that house is being built.
Oh, for sure. Yeah, that's extremely true. And if you take something like the hemochromatosis genes, the example that I gave before, that's a great example of that, because if you have hemochromatosis genes and you're a premenopausal woman with a heavy menstrual flow, or you're an athlete where, an athlete is both giving constant pressure to produce more red blood cells, which is sucking up iron, and athletes, if they engage in intense exercise, have some occult blood loss in the intestines that they don't know about. And, in those cases, that's protecting you from iron overload, or even making you vulnerable to iron deficiency anemia. And the wrong diet can do the same thing. I am predisposed to accumulate too much iron, but I guarantee you that if my diet is all whole grains and leaves, I might actually be able to make myself anemic.
Yeah. And, genetic testing has given us a lot of insight into like MTHFR mutations and things like that. But that does not mean that if you have that MTHFR mutation, that does not mean that you need folinic acid.
Well, it's worse than that, right? And you asked a question I never answered, which is, how do you determine what different types of folate to take? So MTHFR is decreasing your ability to make methylfolate. There's a lot of people out there who take that to mean that they can fix the problem by taking a lot of methylfolate. I guarantee you, and now I'm not against, I do include methylfolate as a supplement in my protocol for dealing with that. But there's a big catch. There's no way on earth anyone can ever make up for a 75% decrease in MTHFR activity with a proportional increase in the methylfolate in their diet. And here's why. If you eat a molecule of folic acid, or you eat a molecule of methylfolate, or you eat a molecule of some other type of folate, it's going to go inside your cells and it's going to stay there for about 200 days. Every day, it's going to have new methyl groups added to it that came from your amino acids 18,000 times. If you wanted to look at this and say, I'm homozygous for the C677T allele of MTHFR, that means I have a 75% decrease in MTHFR activity. If you want to make up for the number of methyl groups that you're not adding to the folate, you would need to take 13,500 times the RDA for folate. It's probably not safe to take anywhere near 13,500 times the RDA for folate as methylfolate. And no one's dumb enough to do that, right? So you have people out there who are taking 800 micrograms or 1.2 grams or maybe, some people, I don't recommend this, but some people are taking 2 or 3 grams of methylfolate. You're taking 3 or 4 times the RDA. That's not 13,500. You're not getting anywhere near compensating for the methylation of folate that you're not doing in your body. So the reason that it's important to have methylfolate, though, is that methylfolate is the off switch for losing methyl groups as glycine. I don't know if you want to get into the biochemistry. I'm happy to riff on that, but you can take it on faith if you don't want to hear the biochemistry.
No, it's fine.
So if you don't have methylfolate, you'll lose glycine. Now, why do you care about glycine? Well, glycine's important for antioxidant defense. It's important for detoxification. It's important for building up your bones. I have a consulting client who has osteoporosis and is doing all the things for osteoporosis that everyone thinks about, like calcium and vitamin D and vitamin K2 and, the whole shebang.
Resistance exercise.
Yeah, all of it. Yeah. There's plenty of things to do, right? So put the anabolic stimulus on your bones, like get rid of all your catabolic stressors, et cetera, et cetera. But here's the thing. Your bone is half mineral and it's half protein. And that protein is 95% collagen. And collagen is 1/3 glycine, which is 6 times richer in glycine than any of your other proteins are. So if you're losing glycine, that's probably not good for your bones. And glycine also is important for calming in the central nervous system. It helps you sleep at night. Glycine is important to prevent overmethylation. So it's preventing like the distraction, for example. So if you're losing glycine, you need to put a stop to that glycine. So you need to have methylfolate in the diet. But you can't fool yourself into thinking that you're taking double the methylfolate and all of a sudden you're canceling out the nutritional implications of the MTHFR. And a lot of people are not paying attention to the fact that the most evidence-based nutritional implication of MTHFR is that it doubles your need for choline. Because choline is like, no matter how much methylfolate you put in there, like I said before, you are not going to get your folate-based methylation up to normal. So you're always going to be more reliant on choline, which is the alternative methyl donor. And if you don't have enough choline, then you might not have enough phosphatidylcholine. That causes fatty liver. You might not have acetylcholine. If you're lower in acetylcholine, you might have muscular weakness. You might have, and here's where it gets tricky, right? Because a lot of these things can all get jumbled together as fatigued. Like I feel fatigued. Well, that could be anemia, but it could be that, it could be that lack of motivation, right? If your brain is making you put your motivation on something because of dopamine, once your motivation and attention is there, you need acetylcholine to power through whatever you're trying to achieve in that moment, right? So like I'm putting my attention on doing this podcast with Guillermo, and that created a big enough dopamine spike that I was like, yeah, let's do this podcast.
Do this. Yeah.
And I'm focused on you, man. I'm focused because of dopamine. But why am I killing it? I'm killing it because of acetylcholine. And if my acetylcholine levels were sapped, I'd be like, Guillermo, like I'm focusing on you, man, but I'm just not feeling it. Like I don't know where my mojo went, you
I don't
know?
know. I don't know where to go with this folate thing.
Yeah. So MTHFR is having a big impact on many things that are not folate, like glycine and choline. You know this, you know it, awesome. If you did 2 weeks of research into these things, awesome. I made a podcast about this once. If you know about that and you had 2 hours of fortitude, awesome. But here it is condensed into a couple paragraphs in this cheat sheet. So
And then the chronometer or tracking app, it's just so revealing, because you might think, oh, I eat enough green leafy vegetables. I always go to Costco and I get 6 pounds of frozen spinach. So then you run the numbers and they look normal, but then you realize that frozen spinach doesn't have the folate that you think you're ingesting.
yeah.
So like the nuance, in all of this is just so mind blowing.
So hold on a second. So I had a case once where someone switched from like cut out white flour from their diet and started eating a lot of fruits and vegetables. And she started developing early signs of folate deficiency anemia. So I made a video about this last year because a lot of people are going to look at that situation and they're going to be like, white bread, bad. Vegetables, good. And so there's no consciousness that you could actually give yourself a nutrient deficiency from that. Although, yes, you want the forms of folate that are in food, and that's not folic acid. It's better to have folic acid than to have no folate. And if you think that your spinach that's been in some freezer before it was shipped for 6 months and then is in yours for 1 month before you eat it has more folate than your white bread does, you're wrong. Right? And so I'm not saying like everyone should eat white bread. I'm just saying you have to be able to recognize these patterns or you're going to miss important deficiencies.
Another big one is salt. Going from a heavily processed diet to a natural, evolutionary, non-processed diet, one of the things that suffers the most is salt. So then people start feeling, like their electrolyte imbalances starts going the wrong way, and then they get discouraged because, yeah, sure, they're losing weight, but now they get up in the morning and they fall over because they don't have enough blood pressure.
Yeah, salt is super interesting. So it's the sodium, but also there's another sort of analogous switch that people do in the health world where they may not be anti-salt, but they may switch to like Celtic sea salt or something like that, and they may be totally unaware that they were medicating themselves for iodine deficiency when they were eating iodized salt, and that's not there anymore, right? But even the salt, so salt is a really interesting case because if you think about what paleo diets were like, probably our paleo ancestors had like 4 times the potassium intake that we have now, and probably lower salt intake than what the average American has. And that's because back in the day, if you wanted salt, you had to go out and seek it. You had to either dig it out of the earth or you had to desalinate ocean water, like boil it or something like that. And meanwhile, before we had easy access to grains, we're basically forced into eating really high potassium foods, especially potassium to calorie ratios, because if you're foraging and you're eating a lot of fruits and vegetables and stuff like that, or even prior to grains, like just eating like starchy tubers and things like that, you're getting way more potassium in those foods. And it's interesting because one of the problems with these imbalances is that you need sodium to excrete potassium in your urine, and you need potassium to excrete sodium. So we likely evolved a taste for salt because our diets were like too high in potassium, and in order to be able to prevent hyperkalemia, we needed to like salt and seek it. So that programmed us to go out and harvest the extra sodium that we needed. We're now in the opposite situation where everyone has salt in their cupboard, and they're eating packaged foods where the food producers put the optimal salt into their food to hit those reward centers in the brain. And yet you really have to go out of your way to even hit the RDA for potassium because it's so easy to eat lower potassium foods. But one of the things that I think might make our sodium needs higher than those of our paleo ancestors is that salt plays an important role in adaptation to stress. And I think we have much higher stress levels in our modern environment. And I think that we don't just eat more salt because we've been programmed to by the food industry, but we eat more salt because when we're stressed, our bodies physiologically demand the consumption of extra salt to handle that stress. And so if we use our big brains to say, hey, I read that our paleo ancestors didn't eat salt, and we override those physiological signals and train ourselves to eat less salt, then I think that's where the health consciousness can get you into big trouble. But there's still the majority case out there is people aren't getting enough potassium and probably have too much salt. But again, it really depends. Are you doing what everyone else is doing, or are you doing your own thing to try to be better than everyone else? Which camp you fall into is going to probably going to be one of the main determinants of how you need to balance your electrolytes.
So what's the answer? Just eat bananas covered in potassium chloride and give yourself an arrhythmia.
The answer is salt to taste, and don't impose on yourself ridiculous standards that make you rewire your taste, but just follow your instinct. The physiological drive to eat salt is very strong. And if you just say, I'm not gonna be ideological about it, I'm just gonna add salt as like to whatever tastes good, that's probably giving you enough sodium. We don't have a physiological drive for potassium in the same way, and it's probably because our ancestors were eating 12 grams of potassium a day. And so they didn't need a physiological drive to eat potassium. It was just a normal state of what was available in the food. So I think that measuring your blood pressure is one of the best things that you can do, because your blood pressure, like, there are other things that impact your blood pressure. Your physical activity is important. Not abusing alcohol is important. Stress management is important. But one of the overwhelming determinants of your blood pressure is the amount of sodium that's circulating outside of your cells. Sodium sucks up water. The reason that you can dry out meat by salting it is because the sodium sucks the water out of the meat. If the sodium is in your blood, you're essentially drying out your pee. So the sodium is holding on to water, and you're peeing out less water as a result. So your blood volume expands. If you have enough potassium, your kidneys just use the potassium to handle the sodium, and they just bring it down to normal. But if you don't have enough potassium, your blood volume expands to the point where you drive a higher blood pressure. And although that high blood pressure is bad for you, it actually causes the excretion of sodium in the kidneys. So it's like the best way is to have enough potassium. And if you can't get rid of the sodium that way, you're just going to have a natural adaptive rise in your blood pressure in order to push the sodium into your urine. But, if you always have high blood pressure, that's going to be doing a lot of damage to your vascular system. So if you measure your blood pressure when you're at home and you're calm and you're following the instructions and you're not reading it too much into each measurement, you take 3, do it every day, do it in some different situations, take the average. If your blood pressure is consistently high, the first nutritional thing that I would do is try to improve the potassium levels in your diet. Guillermo, you want to guess what percentage of Americans meet the RDA for potassium?
Less than 50%.
Go down.
30%.
Go down.
10%?
Go down.
5%?
Down.
2%.
2%. You got it, Guillermo.
2%.
2% of Americans. 2% of Americans meet the RDA for potassium, and the RDA for potassium is going to be revised in 2018, probably not downward. And there's a lot of emphasis put on you should restrict salt if you have high blood pressure, or you should restrict salt so you don't get blood pressure. And all the evidence indicates that increasing your dietary potassium is much more powerful for your blood pressure than reducing your sodium. And it's like, why? Well, because sodium only rises your blood pressure when you don't have enough potassium. So No kidding. So I think that's a big indicator. And I would not restrict salt unless increasing your dietary potassium is not sufficient. But I want everyone listening to know that this doesn't necessarily mean just go out and get potassium supplements.
That's really dangerous.
Because in the wrong context, potassium supplements can be really dangerous. So, it's interesting. There have been studies where healthy people have been given 15 grams a day of potassium supplements with no adverse effects. But the FDA regulates potassium supplements so that they can't have more than 99 milligrams. And that's because there's a lot of things that can cause potassium supplements to be dangerous if your kidneys are not capable of excreting potassium at the optimal amount. So if you're depleted of sodium, that's one thing, but that's not that common. The common thing is insulin resistance and use of non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drugs. There's a whole host of other things, but if you just take the number of people who are insulin resistant and the number of people who are using the most common over-the-counter drugs there are, the NSAIDs, that's a big batch of people. And so for those people, if they go out and they're like, oh, I'm not meeting the RDA, I'm going to take 5 grams of potassium to make sure I meet the RDA, they could wind up in the emergency room from that. And even if you don't have a problem with that, potassium on an empty stomach, the potassium causes an insulin response. And if you just take like a gram of potassium on an empty stomach, you might give yourself hypoglycemia. So when you're comparing that to food, like you take, even though the FDA regulates it, you can get a bulk powder on Amazon that from bulk supplements, potassium citrate, right? So what's the serving size? 99 milligrams of this, whatever it works out to, adjusting for the citrate is like, this is the serving, there's 99 milligrams of potassium in it, but it's just a bag, right? Yeah. So you can just like scoop it up,
snort
right?
it.
So I mean, you could give yourself pretty bad hypoglycemia if you're taking that on an empty stomach. Like compare that to eating 2 grams of potassium in a meal. Well, if that potassium is all caught up in vegetable fiber and it's taking you a couple hours to digest that meal, you just got this little slow trickle of potassium while you also have at least as much glucose trickling into your system at the same time. And that's another thing. I don't think this has been studied that clearly, but I'm guessing that if you eat a potassium-rich meal where your carbs are coming from potassium-rich foods, you're probably going to have more stable blood sugar because that potassium is helping you get the insulin response. So if you have this slow leak of glucose and the slow leak of potassium, everything kind of stables out, and you can get 12 grams a day of that if you really focused your diet on it. But if you go and take 12 grams of potassium citrate, you better tell your doctor before you do that and not after.
So Chris, where can I find all this information about how to test for potassium and where to get potassium sources and what signs and symptoms I would have if I have a potassium deficiency?
Well, dude, you could find that, as you know, in the cheat sheet. And so here's what we're doing. So if someone listening to this podcast wants to get the cheat sheet, they should go to chrismasterjohnphd.com/3030strong. That's the numbers 3030 strong. You know how to spell it because you're a fan. And that will direct you to a special page welcoming you as a fan of 3030 strong and giving you a $5 discount. And you can get this discount anytime up to midnight on February 21st Eastern time. Okay, so if you're in the Pacific Northwest, and don't say, oh, it's only 9 o'clock on February 21st, because this is Eastern time, right? So get it by February 20th, just to be safe. And when you do that, you're going to apply 3030 strong, 3030 strong, all in caps, as a discount code. You hit the apply button when you enter it into the discount box, and you should watch the price fall from 30 to 25. Make sure you see the price fall to make sure you've actually claimed your discount. And don't worry about memorizing any of this. If you just go to chrismasterjohnphd.com/3030strong, or Guillermo, I'm sure you'll put the link in the show notes.
100%.
You'll go right to the page where it'll tell you right at the top, this is how you get the discount. You just copy and paste the code. Make sure you hit the apply button, and the cheat sheet is yours.
Oh, man, super excited about this because I have a bunch of friends that are graduating soon that have been studying for boards and studying, school stuff, and maybe they haven't had a chance to dig deep into the newest things that are going on with the health industry, and you're going to catch them up pretty fast.
Yeah, and speaking of newest things, one of the things that I'm doing with this is I'm making it like a living document. Just like my own notes, right? Like if I need to help my clients, I open up the cheat sheet and I start looking through it, like, you know, and I find my own stuff a lot better, right? And so I'm invested in like keeping this up to date. And so what I'm doing is I'm treating it like kind of like a piece of software. So if there's I've already put out version 1.1 of this where I fixed some errors, I added some things, and so probably every couple of months I'm going to go through and clean it up and figure out what's new. And if the updates are minor, I'm just gonna distribute it for free to everyone who purchased it. And if there's ever in the future, if there's some like massive overhaul that really changes the value of it, then I'm gonna give steep discounts to everyone. It's a great way to stay. It's not just a great way to stay up to date, but it will always be a great way to stay up to date.
Dude, thank you so much. Where can people find your work? How can people get a hold of you?
They can go to chrismasterjohnphd.com. That's the home to all of my content. Or you can find me on social media at Chris Masterjohn on YouTube, Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, and Snapchat, but not Musically.
And how come you're not on Musically?
Because I'm not a 14-year-old girl, man. So someday you and I are going to still be making this joke, and all those girls are going to be like 23.
or we'll have Musically accounts because it's going to overtake Facebook.
Yeah, or like in 20 years, Musically will be out of business, and so will Facebook, and we'll still be making this joke, and there'll be like some 35-year-old women will be listening and be like, I remember when I was on Musically back when I was 14.
Dude, thank you so much, for giving me this interview in such a short notice. I was just so excited about this product that I want to get the word out, Any speaking engagements coming up?
I don't know, man. I'm playing it by ear this time. So hopefully I'll show up at PaleoFX, AHS, Weston A. Price, but I'm not sure yet. I'm not committing to anything.
Cool. Okay. Well, dude, thank you. I know time is the only non-renewable
resource.
Resource, yeah,
non-renewable resource.
So we're at an hour sharp right now. Talk to you soon, dude.
Phenomenal, man.
See ya.